It's a great Sunday for us to be together, to worship God and learn more from His Word. In fact, today starts Holy Week. Today is Palm Sunday. We're going to talk about a little bit about that today. But also, I want you to remember that this Friday, all of the Crossbridge campuses, Crossbridge has 5 locations here in Miami, and we're all coming together here at this venue for a Good Friday service at 7 p.m. Okay, so this Friday, it's not good if your brothers and sisters from the other campuses show up and you don't. I'm just saying that. So let's welcome them. We're going to have way more chairs in here, and it's important that you show up early, otherwise you're not going to have a seat. So this Friday, 7 p.m., invite somebody, and then invite someone to our Easter Sunday celebration that will be next Sunday. And the statistics are there to show us that the odds are with us, that if you invite people, chances are that they will say yes. Out of every 2 people that you invite, 1 will for sure say yes, okay? So start calling people, texting people, sharing the avatars that we've made available to you to invite people. You never know. It's an invitation that can make an eternal difference in someone's life. I know many, many people that someone invited them to an Easter Sunday service, and they went in not expecting much. They came to faith, and now they're serving Jesus with their family. They have had their marriages restored. They have had, their lives worked on by the power of the Holy Spirit. And so you never know what God can do and the impact that can bear in someone's life, a simple invitation. So putting that out there as you also journey with us through Holy Week. As I said, today is Palm Sunday, and Palm Sunday is the celebration of the day that Jesus entered through the gates of Jerusalem. 2,000 years ago, this day, Jesus enters through the gates of Jerusalem, hailed as king. You know, the multitude is welcoming him with palm branches, therefore the name Palm Sunday, and they're setting their cloaks on the road so that Jesus can ride through those streets, over those cloaks, into the gates of the city, hailed as king. And what we see after that episode, which was beautiful and glorious, it was both humble, but it was also powerful, is the trajectory that Jesus then has from the gates of Jerusalem into that week. Naturally, you would think, oh, wow, he's now recognized finally as king by a crowd. His life is only going to get better from now, right? He's reached his moment of coronation. You know, you can only expect things to go better for him. And that's not at all what we read when we read the gospel accounts. What we read in the gospel accounts is actually, instead of his life getting better that week, his life gets worse. Jesus, instead of going in a trajectory towards glory, he goes into a trajectory towards darkness. And what we will see is that in the end, Jesus, as a king would, as he would walk or ride through the gates of a city, make his way into the palace and go to the throne. Jesus does not make his way into a palace, and he does not receive a golden crown and sit on a throne, but a crown of thorns and what we know as the cross. From that moment of welcoming to the end of the week, there's a lot of pain that culminates at the cross. And what we see here is the intensification today. What we'll see here is the intensification of that moment of pain and suffering and darkness in the life of Jesus as he wraps up the Passover meal with his disciples. So this happens on Sunday, right? The triumphal entry. And on Thursday, Jesus is with his disciples celebrating the Passover meal. Pastor David preached about that last Sunday. And now we're going to see the transition from that Thursday night into his moments of great suffering that happen and take place on Friday that leads to his death. This is the transition between that meal and that moment when Jesus is arrested, and then everything goes worse from there. So we're going to find ourselves in Matthew 26, and we'll read verses 30 through 46. So if you have a Bible, you can follow along with me. If not, the passage is printed on the screen behind me. This is what the Word of God says. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus says to him, "Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, this is John and James, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Okay? Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So you could not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the 2nd time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. My betrayer is at hand." This is the word of the Lord. You know, one of the interesting things here in this passage is that we have an insight into Jesus that we do not have up until this point in the gospel accounts. What we see here in Jesus is beautiful. What we see here in Jesus is deeply intriguing because as at that meal, at that Last Supper meal that Jesus has with his disciples, that his heart begins to be filled with anguish. So much so that Jesus cannot even finish the Passover meal. It was prescribed to be celebrated. You know, that meal had 4 courses. It's in the 3rd course of that meal. I'm not going to go into details here. Maybe Pastor David explained last week. I didn't hear the sermon. But it's during that 3rd course of the meal, going into the 4th, that Jesus is already bothered because Judas is sitting at the table. He knows what's about to happen. And the text tells us that he stands up from the table before celebrating the 4th course, and he sings this song, and he makes his way into the Garden of Gethsemane. And what we see here in Jesus is amazing. I believe that my hope as we go through this passage is that you would see yourself in Jesus. As Jesus felt, that you would feel as well. As Jesus experienced what he experienced here, that you would experience as well. As Jesus portrayed a specific posture, that posture would be present in your life so that other people would see Jesus in you. Because when other people are able to see Jesus in us, there's something powerful and beautiful and unique. And this is what this text is leading us towards. So what do we see in Jesus that we would like to see in our lives as well? As Jesus stands up from that table that at that very moment begins to crack, the table of the disciples, the table of his closest friends begins to crack. What do we see in Jesus? First, we see his deep humanity. Secondly, we see his deep trust. And then thirdly, we see his deep love. Let's look at all these 3 things. The first thing that we see is his deep humanity. Jesus begins to go from bad to worse in verses 38 and 39. Look at verses 38 and 39 with me once again. Then he said to them, as they're going and walking into that garden, that he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death, even to death. I know that some of you have felt that way before, and that's how Jesus is feeling right now. He's feeling death. And he says to them, remain here and watch with me. He says, can you just stay with me? I'm just in a very bad place right now. I have these thoughts of death. They're consuming me. Just hang out with me. And then in verse 39, we read, and going a little farther, he fell on his face. I think this is interesting because it goes along with the theme of the location where Jesus finds himself. Jesus is in this place called the Garden of Gethsemane. It's in the Mount of Olives. If you've been to Israel, it's this garden that overlooks the city of Jerusalem. It has, many little olive trees and many little gardens within that major garden. And as Jesus walks into that place known as Gethsemane, and the word Gethsemane means the olive press, because that's how you make olive oil, right? You take the olives and you put them in a press and you squeeze them tight, and then the oil comes out at the bottom. And so Jesus is here at the olive press garden known as Gethsemane. And the name of the garden is the depiction of what's happening inside his heart. The pressure is increasing like you would do in a press, right? You put more and more pressure so that you get more and more oil coming out at the bottom. So there is more and more pressure over Jesus's heart and his soul. And, he begins to feel sorrowful to death up to the point that he collapses. He collapses with sadness. And when you read the parallel passage in the Gospel of Luke, Luke says that it gets so bad, right? So there's this deep anguish in his heart. Then he can't hold on to it anymore. He collapses. He falls down. He loses strength. Like when you get bad news. When you get bad news, you're just like, you get lightheaded, right? And this is what happens to Jesus. And Luke says that as Jesus wrestles with the environment around him and what's about to happen into the future, which he already knows, that he begins to sweat blood. It gets really, really dark and really, really bad. And I think that this is very important for all of us to understand here. I'm sorry this is not an upbeat type of sermon, but it's just preparing us for next week. I'll promise you that next week is going to be a really, really upbeat sermon. But I want you to understand this, that there's something intriguing and fascinating about what's happening here, because we know that Jesus is 100% God, but also we learn that Jesus is 100% man. And when you read about all of the different religions of the world and you read about their founders, no founder of a world religion is ever depicted in this state of weakness. Think about it. No one is ever depicted in this state of weakness except the God of Christianity. And that to me is absolutely fascinating, because what this tells us is that the God of Christianity is not immune to suffering. And because the God of Christianity is not immune to suffering, he understands us better than you may think he does. So many of us go through life and we have this idea and this belief that God doesn't get what's happening with me. God doesn't understand what's happening in my life, because sometimes even the closest people to us, even our spouse sometimes, or our closest friends, do not know what's happening inside of us because they've never gone through what we're going through right now. I remember when Beth and I had our first miscarriage, and it was tough. And I'll tell you this, it was way harder for her than it was for me, even though I suffered too, but I got over it way faster because it was not me that had the miscarriage and a airport bathroom. Okay, it was not me. I was not the one that went through it. And a few months later, I'm already, moving on, and I come to her in the kitchen and I say, hey, don't worry about it. We can always try this again. By the way, that's the worst thing that you can say to your spouse if that has ever happened. And they'll tell you. I mean, I'm so blessed that she was so grace and generous that she didn't slap me up my face. But she just looked at me and just said, you don't get it, do you? And then you had all the Christian people that come to you with these Bible verses and trust the Lord and, Romans 8:28, and you're like, what's going on? You don't get it. But the God of Christianity, our God, gets it because he went through everything that we have gone through. He had a mental and emotional breakdown. That's crazy to me. That his soul entered into the first stages of this panic that some of you have experienced. He knows what it's like. And I think this is important and significant for us to heal us as a community because for many years, especially if you're, most people here come from a Latin background. And in our culture, we always, in the past, used to ostracize people that had emotional health issues or mental health issues. Oh, they're weirdos and that sort of thing, right? Now there's been more awareness towards that, but we used to ostracize. I mean, I remember back in the days when, people close to our family said that they wanted to see a psychologist. Say, oh, that person is crazy, isn't it? Oh, they're going to a psychologist, right? We've stigmatized people that have shown, mental health fragility and weakness, and people that have weakness in life. We actually sometimes we find ourselves distancing ourselves from those who are struggling in life, not just emotionally, but in every area. Because say, oh, I don't want this negativity over me, right? How many of you heard that? And the God of the universe in Jesus Christ, because he is 100% God and 100% man, human, he refuses to do so. And he understands those that go through it because he went through it himself. So he gets you. And there's a blessedness on top of that in finding God and identifying with God and connecting with God from a place of weaknesses versus a place of strength. Remember the Beatitudes? It's the poor in spirit that inherit the kingdom. It's those that mourn that are consoled. It's those that come to Jesus with a hunger and thirst for justice that have their hearts and their souls satisfied. If you come to Jesus in strength, there's nothing for you there, only if you come to him in weakness. And what this passage is encouraging us to do, and the people that this passage is encouraging us to be, is to be vulnerable people. I was reading Brené Brown, this psychologist. She's a Christian, but she's very well known in the secular world, and she's written extensively about this topic of vulnerability. And she says, contrary to what we think of vulnerability being a sign of weakness, is actually a sign of deep courage and strength. And so, be vulnerable with God. What Jesus is doing here in praying to God and letting his heart rip before the Father is what the psalmist did in the Psalms. They go to God and they talk about their weakness, and they talk to God about their anger, and they talk to God about their frustrations. See, prayer is a third way and most helpful way to deal with your feelings. We are either taught to stuff our feelings and keep a stiff upper lip. That's what the new Stoicism teaches you how in this culture today, and, run away from that. And religion also teaches you that as well. Don't show signs of weakness, and you just talk about, the good things and the virtues that you have. And then, modern psychology tells you just to let everything out, everything out. But the Bible says, take that which you have and just take it to God and process it with him. This is the safest way to deal with your feelings. It's okay. It's healthy for you to show anger, for you to express frustration and disappointment. Even with God, let me tell you something. God is a big boy. He can handle all of that. So you can be vulnerable with God, and you can be vulnerable with others too. Oh, I don't want people to have an insight into the fragile aspects of my heart and my soul. C.S. Lewis, Christian thinker and writer, used to say this, that to love is to be vulnerable, right? If you're going to love anything, he says, even an animal, you have to invest your heart. Now, there's a risk always that your heart will be broken. Some of you have invested your heart and you were vulnerable with people, and they betrayed your trust and they betrayed your vulnerability. But he says it's okay, even though you take on this risk, it's still better to take on this risk, because the alternative, if you never take this risk, is that you will become a cold person, you will become unknown, you will isolate yourself, and ultimately you will die. The people that hide their weakness, the people that are not vulnerable about their weakness, they're the loneliest people of all. They're the ones who suffer the most. And Jesus refuses to be that person because he is a perfect human, and he encourages us in that direction as well, to be vulnerable with God and to be vulnerable with others as well, because that's part of what our healing looks like. That's the pathway, that's the map, that's the blueprint for our healing in life. Secondly, we not only see his deep humanity, but we see his deep trust in God. So I'm astounded when I read verse 30, because verse 30 tells us, which was the very first verse that we read, that says that when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So you were to sing these Psalms, Psalm 113 through Psalm 118. These are known as the Hallel Psalms as you move from course 3 to course 4 in the Passover meal. And Jesus stands up. He still sings these songs as he is making his way into the garden. So he stands up, he's singing the songs, and he's singing all the way to the garden. Now let's revisit this. His heart is pressed. His soul is crushed. And he is singing these Hallel Psalms. And what most commentators believe is that the song that Jesus was singing at that very moment was Psalm 118, because it's the last song that you would sing as you would move on to the fourth course of the meal. So Jesus is singing Psalm 118. You know what Psalm 118 says? Here's Jesus walking into the garden, singing this. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. How can you sing something like that when all you see in front of you is darkness and misery? I mean, this is a good song to sing when you know that morning, the morning that you wake up, you're going to have a promotion, or you're going to go out and hang out at the beach with your family. It's easy to wake up and say, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it, because you know that a lot of great things are about to happen that day. But when everything is dark and you can't see what's in front of you besides darkness, to sing that is rough, tough. To pronounce words that your heart does not feel at the moment is rough, it's tough, it's hard. You can only do that under two circumstances: to pronounce words that your heart does not feel at the moment, or your heart does not believe and agree in the moment. Okay? Number one, if you are afraid of the consequences, if you really speak out your heart to the people around you. And that's Peter later on. That's Peter later on. He still loves Jesus, but when they say, hey, do you know this guy here that we have arrested, this heretic? So, oh, no, I have nothing to do with this guy. So he lies because he's afraid of what the truth will do to him. That's Peter. That's the disciples. That's you and I. We lack integrity. Or you will say that. You will say this truth. You will pronounce this, even if your heart does not feel like it in the moment. If you have a deep conviction of the truth that God is worth being trusted, regardless. If you truly believe that He is the shepherd leading you through the valleys of the shadows of death, you have to have that deep conviction to do that. And that is what we see in Jesus. He doesn't see anything at that moment but darkness. He knows what's going to happen. It's hard. He's asking the Father, hey, is there a chance to skip this part? Can we just save him without me having to suffer? He knows. And it's all dark and it's all misery, and he feels it. He's 100% human, like I said. But he still moves forward, and he still goes to God and says, but your will be done. Your will be done. He prays that part of the Lord's Prayer, which, by the way, is the only place that you actually really read Jesus praying a piece of the prayer that he taught his disciples. Your will be done. He says that 3 times, and he goes and he moves through. What does it take to have this type of trust, right? Do we have this type of trust? Are you able today, I don't know what the circumstances look like for you, and maybe you're out of hope today, the future doesn't look bright to you, and you're completely discouraged. In that space, in that place of life, in that place of heart right now, can you stand up and say, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let me rejoice and be glad in it? There's got to be a resolve. I will rejoice and be glad in it. I had a pastor that I used to work with in the past, and he has this like cheesy line, which I think is true. He said, rejoice is a choice. You have to resolve to rejoice, to trust, even when it does not look like it will lead you anywhere good. Because your ultimate destination is not the goodness that you expect and you want to see, but it's the goodness of the God that takes you in the journey towards there. So you're able to do that. See, for you to have this type of deep trust, you have to really trust a deep love. There's no other way. You know, the reason why your kids will trust you, if you tell them, if you walk inside the house one day and say, hey, drink this, and it's poison, so drink it, it's going to be good for you, and it's going to taste great, they'll do it without questioning because they trust the love. You know, obviously, we don't use that for evil, although people have in the past used it for evil, but, you know, they just have this belief that's deeply ingrained in them that, you know, my parents love me. They can be wrong about it, but they have that belief inside of them, and so they'll do whatever you ask. Sometimes you have to discipline them through, but it's another story, another sermon. But the only way that you can really trust God is if you know that he has a deep love for you, and this is the last thing that we see here in this passage, his deep love for us. You know, we see here the deep love of Jesus and his love for God and his love for people. Now, I want you to understand this, that there's no way that you can display a deep love for God unless you display a deep love for people. There's a lot of people that are really passionate about God, but they're really rude and mean to people, and if that's true, there's no way that you can truly love God. You love yourself, you love an ideology, you love other things, because if you're rude and mean to people that see things differently than you do, or have the different walk of life that you have had, you can't say you love God, because loving God is proportionate to loving people, and that's what we see here in Jesus. His love for God is displayed by the way in which he loves his disciples. How do the disciples love Jesus? Poorly. That's how they love Jesus here in the story. Jesus says to them, to the closest ones, come on, man, like he has Peter, James, and John. He's given his time, 3 full years of his life to all of them, but specifically to Peter, James, and John. I mean, he would take these guys to the private places of prayer. They saw him being transfigured right before their very eyes. I mean, Jesus took them into really intimate places. He shared his life with them, and then in his most vulnerable moment, he says, hey, would you just stay with me and pray? What do? They fall asleep on him. And then he goes back and wakes them up. And okay, all right, we'll hang around. He says, okay. And then when he looks to the side, they're asleep again. And this happens 3 times. Now, most of us would not give a chance to sometimes a friend that would do that to us for the 3rd time. We say, 3rd strike, man, you're out. But this is just to show the deep love and grace that Jesus has for his disciples, the patience that he has for them, which is a big evidence of his love for the Father. And so because he won't quit on his friends, he is showing that he will follow through with the Father's plan, and he will obey you, and he will surrender his will. And that's why he says, your will be done, not mine. And what that shows is this, because that's the place where Jesus is coming from, in the garden, in the midst of his sadness, he will not allow, in fact, he will refuse to allow his grief and his pain and his sadness to stand in the way of his service to his disciples. I think this is amazing. As I was thinking this through this past week, you know, sometimes when I don't feel good, I hurt other people, because hurt people hurt others. And the last thing that I want to do is help others when I'm hurting because I say, oh, no one is looking at me. No one is helping me. Why should I help anyone? Right? There is a way of being fully consumed with yourself, even in your moments of pain and suffering, and that's most of us. But Jesus refuses to allow his pain and his suffering to get in the way of his service to his disciples. And because we see this, him going and following through, even in the context of the deepest pain, in his moment of most vulnerability, we can know without a reasonable doubt that he is a good and loving God. How many times he should have given up on you? You have not only fallen asleep on Jesus 3 times, but 10 times, 100 times every day. And he is still merciful and graceful to you. You see what we're trying to get to here? This is the type of trust and the type of love that we need. See, without this type of trust in God and this love for God and people, we cannot be the humans that God has created us to be. The problem is that it's not that we are too human. The problem is it's because we're not too human. To be fully human is to have this deep trust in God and to have this deep love for God and for others. This is what we need, to fully be humans like Jesus. This quality of humanity that Jesus has, this is what we need. And this is the type of love and trust that we need in order to rebuild and repair the broken tables that we sit in life. If you don't trust God, as you're extending forgiveness to somebody, as you are offering repentance to somebody, if you don't trust God, you can't do it. If you don't have a notion of God's deep love for you, sacrificial, loving you constantly through all of your shortcomings, you can't offer any love to anybody that's deep. It's always going to be an exchange. It's always going to be transactional. But when you understand this type of love and this type of trust that Jesus has, and to the degree that you do understand his love for you, it builds in a trust for God and a love for others that is supernatural, that gets you and I to where we need to be.